Hello and welcome to Buy Africa, the show where we focus on investment opportunities around the continent. I'm Tapo Mudiba, and thanks for joining me. Tonight, I'm joined by Ronak Gopaldis, Africa macro strategist at Rand Merchant Bank. Ronak, thanks for joining us.
Sure.
I love these geopolitical discussions, debates that we have. Big elections coming up, East Africa, Kenya. Let's before we get to the elections itself, where are we with Kenya? And what do these elections actually mean?
Elections are very, very important in Kenya. Are they going to be like 2007, which was messy, which saw over 1,000 people die in the aftermath with ethnic-related violence, or are they going to be more like 2013, which went off relatively peacefully? Those are the big questions that investors are asking. The other one is it going to be a first-round victory or a runoff? And then what does this mean for the economy? So Kenya's been growing quite nicely, strong focus on infrastructure drive, under this Jubilee administration, and the election I think is quite critical in order to see the economy sustain its gains and to kick on really.
And I guess it's not just important for Kenya itself. We've seen quite a bit of regional integration. So probably if you're an investor across East Africa, you're probably looking at this quite closely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of regional integration in Africa, the East African region is by far the most advanced, and Kenya as the largest economy in the region really matters. The economy for a while has been on a good footing, but recently there's been issues around the cost of living, which is going to make this election very competitive. From an investor point of view, what are the issues that we're looking at? One is the currency. Is there going to be the natural investor anxiety and massive currency depreciation? On that score, we're not particularly concerned because the Central Bank of Kenya does have a good war chest, and in addition, they've also got the IMF standby facility. They also haven't been shy to intervene periodically as and when they've needed to.
Right.
The second issue is around the interest rate cap that was instituted last year, which has really affected the banking sector and private sector growth. Will that fall away after the election? That's what everyone's watching. Fiscal consolidation is going to be very important after the election. We're in an election cycle, so we know that a lot of populist campaign promises are made. There was a recent report that came out that said that Kenya's debt to GDP ratio is 52%, which is over the East African convergence level.
Right.
So there are going to need to be some really hard decisions made after the election in order to steady that fiscal ship. On the question around policy orientation, is there really a difference between Raila Odinga and Uhuru Kenyatta and their parties? I think broadly speaking, both parties are aligned to Vision 2030. There is not much in it, I guess, from that perspective, and Kenya remains largely a business-friendly country. So, those are the big economic issues that we're watching.
Right. So let's separate the economic issue from short-term to long-term in terms of, I guess, our assessment of the impact. What are the short-term risks of this election?
So again, like I mentioned, the first issue is violence. Is there going to be violence in the aftermath of this election? In 2007, after the violence, the economy tanked completely, growing at around 0%. Right. I think what investors are more worried about this time, rather than systemic violence, is the issue of the legal challenge. It's going to be a very, very close election. It's high stakes. It's tense. Whether we get an outright winner or a runoff remains to be seen. And if there is a very narrow margin of victory, that sets the scene for a legal contestation, which will need to be resolved. So what happens in that period and the behavior of politicians will be important. Will the protests happen through the courts, as they did in 2013, or through the streets, as they did in 2007? So that's what we're watching. In my mind, there's sufficient institutional credibility and momentum built into the system. The judiciary and the Electoral Commission is still, in my mind, credible enough to administer a good election. And there have also been some substantial structural changes which have offset this winner-takes-all system that Kenya has had in the past, and thus diluted the prospects for national violence, in my mind.
I guess from a policy perspective, you talk about the winner-takes-all principle that they've had. Does a narrow victory mean anything, or really it's a case of who wins from a policy perspective? That's what we must assess here?
So nobody ever likes uncertainty, right? So, I mean, in an ideal world, you'd get a clear winner with a transparent process and a gracious loser.
Of course.
But unlikely that that's going to happen. I think just also given the fact that Kenya's elections are largely based on ethnic arithmetic and ethnic voting lines, and given the fact that it's almost 50-50 on that score, it's definitely going to be close. So I think what is a given almost is legal contestation and protests. And if it is a second round, that needs to happen within 30 days after it's gone through the court proceedings. So, from that perspective, I think that will create some short-term uncertainty and anxiety. And given the kind of urgent priorities for the Kenyan economy, most especially in terms of fiscal consolidation, I think this would act as a distraction. So we need a quick, snappy resolution of this election so that we can focus on the broader economic issues at hand.
In terms of, I guess, polling or some sort of assessment of the likely direction, is there any hint at a direction of where the elections are going to go?
Yeah, I mean, polls are mixed, right? So some polls have Odinga narrowly in the lead, others have Kenyatta narrowly in the lead.
So really nothing.
nothing in it. And I think one of the big factors is really going to be turnout on election day.
Right.
There is a large sense of apathy. So from traditional supporters of the Jubilee Party, a little bit of disappointment around what they've achieved, and then with Odinga campaigning for the fourth time of asking, there's a little bit of fatigue around his candidacy amongst his constituency.
Right.
And I think what's going to be quite critical is how both parties energize their voter bases, given the fact that there's going to be a razor-thin margin in this election. So turnout, apathy, the youth vote, which is going to be an interesting one because you've got a large swathe of youth voters coming into the system this time. Are they going to vote on ethnic lines, as has historically been the case in Kenya, or are they going to vote more on issues? The cost of living and the state of the economy has made this election a lot more competitive than it should have been, at least theoretically, 6 months ago. So, there are a lot of moving parts in this election. That's why it's very difficult to make a high conviction call.
Right. I guess in the short term, you've outlined the big risks. If you're taking a long-term view on Kenya, is this really just a blip that you need to ride out for the next 6 months, irrespective of what happens in the elections? Or is there something potentially fundamental that could change here?
No, like I mentioned, the policy orientation remains broadly the same, and I'm optimistic that despite a few short-term bumps through this election, a little bit of uncertainty and anxiety, eventually things will settle down. Thereafter, Kenya's got a very strong infrastructure focus, and the pace of that is whilst the investment is for productive gains, they need to be very careful around whether they're overshooting the mark fiscally. So, from that perspective, I think Kenya's got a diversified economy. It's got a sophisticated financial sector. It's well integrated regionally, geographically. There's a lot of appetite for Kenya from the west and the east. So it's really set for liftoff in the aftermath of this election. But typically in election cycles, you get policy inertia and things slow down. Kenya's no different. So I think it's a distraction, and it's something that needs to be done properly, and we need a clear, stable outcome after this. But longer term, I'm still quite optimistic about the prospects of the Kenyan economy.
So, best case scenario in terms of these elections, Kenya is actually set to do really, really well economically.
Yeah. However, there's nothing. I'm an economist, so there are always caveats. I think the long-term prospects are good, but the oil and gas sector, for example, that needs to materialize, and there needs to be strong focus and investment on that front. And you can't divorce the politics from the economics, not only in Africa but anywhere globally. So from that perspective, I think what we'd like to see is the political willingness to really focus on the basics, on the infrastructure, fiscal consolidation, the infrastructure cap, as I mentioned, and then stimulating this growth and more regional integration.
We touched a little bit on the regional integration story. What are the risks, I guess, if we go the other way and the elections are violent? What are the risks for neighboring countries in and around Kenya?
So one important point to raise is that in Kenya, an incumbent has never lost an election. Now, if you look at the neighborhood, Rwanda's also got elections in August. That's a foregone conclusion. President Museveni has been in power for a significant period of time in Uganda. And, you know, that creates a prospect of a bit of tension if, for example, the opposition does win the election. You know, because typically the leaders in the region tend to stay around for a while. Yeah. So that regional dynamic, it does work well. I mean, Kenyatta, Museveni and Kagame all get on pretty well, and there's been kind of great strides made amongst the East African community in recent years. So I'm optimistic that it will continue in the same vein.
So I guess from an investor hat, we probably prefer the status quo because we understand the status quo.
I think, you know, like I mentioned, there's not much in it policy-wise. I think with any new administration, though, what you are going to have is that people settling into a new administration, new positions, and following through on the campaign promises. I think, you know, with any incumbent, there is potentially the upside for quicker, snappier policies because it's a maintenance of a status quo, and you can focus more on execution rather than re-election. So from that perspective, perhaps in the initial period, there would be some short-term kind of disruption and settling in, but over the longer term, the Vision 2030 is going to be what guides policy in Kenya.
All right, perfect. Let's leave it there. Thanks to my guest, Ronak Gopaldus, Africa macro strategist at Rand Merchant Bank. That's all from Buy Africa this week. Remember to follow me on Twitter. That's @Modiba_Tsepo. And send us your thoughts about the show using the hashtag BuyAfrica. For myself and the team,